Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. We too would like to see a merman. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, welcome. In this fourth series of the podcast, we're looking at teen horror movies in depth, reminiscing about our teenage decisions and exploring why teenagers, and especially teenage girls, make some of the most compelling protagonists and villains of the genre. We're now way past halfway through the season. The year is 2011. We're on the verge of a turning point in horror. Torture porn has come and gone. The grindhouse aesthetic was but a blip. YA horror is on the out, and we're about to enter a new level of meta-ness in horror filmmaking. Is The Cabin in the Woods a teen horror, you ask? Well, kind of. I think it counts. Maybe about 50% of it. And if only because I was desperate to talk about this film. And joining me on this existential deep dive is the wonderful Steph McKenna. A quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK. We also have a Patreon where you can support our work and get occasional bonus episodes. The next one coming out will be a deep dive review of Julia Ducournau's Titan. If you don't want to support us over on Patreon, absolutely no problem. But if you could take a few seconds and leave us a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hugely appreciated. It really helps keep us in the charts and it really helps people discover the show. And if you're new to the podcast, then please keep in mind that we talk spoilers pretty much from the very beginning. This is especially important with this film. I've warned you, if you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, there are spoilers ahead. And with all of that said, please enjoy our in-depth discussion of The Cabin in the Woods. Steph, I'm so glad we finally made it. It's been a journey to this recording.
What a week it's been. We're here. Take 6, something like that.
Yes, for a bit of background information and just for fun, we've been struggling to schedule this recording because either Steph was sick or I was sick or we couldn't align our schedules, and we just had to reschedule about 5 times. But we're here.
You're so forgiving. It was so kind of you. I was just like, I wake up every morning and go, I'm still sick. It was like I was kind of stuck in my own cabin in the woods and I just needed to get, I don't know what kind of reference I'm trying to make there, but I was just desperately trying to get out of this lurgy hole and it wasn't happening. So thank you very much for your patience. And this is like the nice payoff after being sick for about 6 days, is that I finally get to do this.
I mean, because you were very right. And I think for this film in particular, we have to be at the top of our game.
Oh, don't say that. I'm like 75. I'm 75%. Hopefully that's enough.
I think that'll be enough. And also, I'm in a very hyper mood, so I think we'll balance each other out.
You really are. You're maxed out. So I've been for a run. I'm like eating my protein bar. Like, oh my God, I'm in my pajamas. I haven't washed my hair.
I think this is a good balance of energy. I think, my hyperness and your 75%ness is going to gel very nicely.
Together. It's going to be a beautiful, beautiful thing.
So, Steph, this was probably one of the films that I was most looking forward to discussing in this season. And I'm so excited for the next hour and a bit that we're going to be talking about it. But let's go back to the beginning with your relationship with The Cabin in the Woods. Do you remember when you first watched it? And do you remember what you expected or kind of how you felt when you first encountered this film?
Yeah, I do. I have a very vivid memory of seeing this film at the cinema. I first heard of this because of Joss Whedon and his attachment to it as a sort of writer and producer. And I wouldn't say I'm like a complete Whedon head. I'm just a very big Buffy fan, essentially. So saw the name, I saw the poster, very Evil Dead, can you go wrong with a cabin in the woods as a horror setting? Never. You know, bit Cabin Fever, bit Friday the 13th. And I figured it would be, on first impression from the poster, a slasher. And I guess my first inkling that this may not be a traditional teen horror was from seeing the trailer. And I think you get the shot of the bird flying into the force field. So I was like, okay, there's something a bit Big Brother about this. And then I vividly remember going to the cinema and seeing this and having so much fun. Like, it's an absolute feast for a horror movie fan. There's so much to unpack. And it felt to me like a real celebration of the tropes and the characters that I love the most, as well as being a very tongue-in-cheek look at sort of those cliches as well that maybe are a bit, you know, they're silly, maybe they're a bit stale. You know, there's decades of seeing teens hacked to pieces, so I could totally get the tongue-in-cheek aspect of that from that first viewing. But mostly my memory of it is a celebration, and I've probably seen this film probably a dozen times since, and I really don't get tired of it. I kind of crave seeing that lift scene in particular. And sometimes when I go into this, like this week when I went into watching this, I was like, I was so pumped to talk about this. I haven't seen it in a few years. Maybe I watch it and actually it's not as good as I remember. And I always think that before I go in, and then I come out of it and I'm like, no, this is actually really fucking good. It is so good. It's one of the genuinely funny horror comedies out there. I think Shaun of the Dead is number 1 for me, but this is like a top 5.
Yes. I mean, you kind of nailed my memory, my experience of it as well. I actually don't remember watching it for the first time. It's almost like the cabin in the woods materialized, fully formed in my head. And I don't remember the first time I watched it, the first time I was surprised by it, but I've seen it also maybe like a dozen times. And similarly to you, it's never not a banger. Every
Isn't
time.
It great.
It's always funnier than the last time I saw it. I'm always seeing tiny things or tiny even elements of the performances that I hadn't noticed before. I'm always seeing like small details in the way, in the characters or in the backgrounds that I hadn't noticed before. And I think perhaps, I don't know, maybe it's an age thing as well, but it just becomes funnier and funnier every time I watch it.
I think you're absolutely right. Seeing it in the cinema for the first time, I was, you know, I'd seen Scream. I was aware of, you know, a lot of the tropes, but as you say, kind of, what was that, 2012? So we're like 10 years on from that. My kind of understanding of the genre, my experience of the genre is so much bigger now that actually you go back to that and you have another sort of more critical layer of perspective that you didn't have on those earlier viewings. And it's like, oh, actually, there's definitely things that this film is trying to say that I didn't pick up on 10 years ago at all. So it's been really nice to come back to this. And also I don't think I've ever done any background reading on this film, really. So reading a bit more on the background of sort of Whedon and Goddard's sort of approach to the film, to have this conversation was really interesting. Partly it made absolute sense to me, and partly I was like, men, you need to chill out a little bit. Like, you're taking things a little bit seriously. But I'm sure we can talk about that as well. But yes, I think it's just the film that keeps on giving, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm going to say it right now, and I'm sure we'll like rip apart the statement as the conversation goes on. But I think, having rewatched it a few days ago, it's arguably the best meta horror film after Scream.
Oh, yeah.
It's on the par for me.
It is. I would completely agree. And I find horror comedies can be very hit and miss as well. And the humor is so on point for this film. It makes me laugh every time. It never gets old. And as you say, it's always clever, but not in a... I don't think it doesn't come across as it thinks it's clever. It kind of brings the audience with it. And it knows that the audience is very clever and very wise to these tropes as well, which is what I think I really enjoy about it.
So let's start digging into the cabin in the woods. So how would you briefly summarize the film for maybe someone who's seen it but doesn't necessarily remember how the plotting goes along?
Yes, there's like absolutely no way to summarize this film without
I'm so sorry.
Being spoilerific. No, not at all. I love a difficult summary, but I was like, this film is like an onion, but it's also sort of like two onions that you're trying to peel at the same time.
It's like
at the same speed.
It's like an onion that has a shallot inside of it.
Yes, when you go, wow, there's another little onion in here. A perfectly formed onion. God, you're so right. That's amazing. Anyway, so we've got 5 American college students. We've got Dana, Jules, Kurt, Marty, and Holden. And they decide to spend the weekend at Kurt's cousin's cabin in the forest, a classic tale. And as you would come to expect from a teen horror film, things begin to unravel as they discover a basement in a cellar full of strange objects. They've got a diary full of Latin incantations, which, upon reading them, accidentally summon an evil upon the cabin. Very reminiscent, in a way, of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead. But in parallel to this, we've got this story which unfolds at an underground laboratory where engineers are executing plans for an ancient ritual to take place. And it's a ritual which places the torture and the murder of these teens at the very centre of a battle to kind of save humankind. So in short, it's everything you'd expect and almost nothing you'd expect from a film about a bunch of extremely hot teens being hunted down by a bunch of zombie rednecks in the woods. The end.
Beautiful. And I'm especially so impressed that you said Kurt's cousin's cabin in such a
cousin's cabin
nonchalant way.
I know, with a cold.
I know. Very impressive. I think you're up to like 85%.
Oh, thank you so much. I've boosted. You can tell I do some reading for a living because I didn't trip over that.
So you again, just to reiterate, as I've mentioned in the introduction to this episode, but this is entirely spoilerific. So if for any reason you're listening this far along and you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, everything is going to be spoiler territory. Every single word that comes out of my mouth.
This discussion would make no fucking sense
Absolutely
at all.
not.
You'd just be like, what is this present? So yeah, definitely make sure you've watched it.
So I guess my first real point of conversation is, what do you make of this Russian doll type structure that the film has?
It's really interesting because not only are your expectations of how a kind of teen slasher unfolds, not only are those expectations blown apart, but I think for me, like my expectations of something like a bit more meta and more satirical are kind of blown apart too. So you've got, if I knew about this dual narrative of the kind of the teens and the underground lab in advance, I would expect us to kind of meet the teens, and then about halfway through the film would reveal this big twist, you know, they're actually being manipulated, they're puppets, these engineers are in this underground bunker. But actually we meet the engineers first, and the opening scene is one of my favourites for that reason. And I remember being in the cinema and kind of going, what the fuck, when this first opened? Like, am I in the wrong screening? Like, we're brought right into the story's orbit from the start. We are introduced to this mythology behind the film kind of from the opening credits, really. We've got these hints at sacrifice and ritual, and we meet these engineers in the underground lab first. So it's all on the table from the start, and we kind of follow this parallel back and forth telling both sides of the stories. But then the stories collide in a way that I didn't expect, with kind of Dana and Marty making it inside the facility about an hour in. And I always, it's kind of that moment where they make it into the facility and they meet the puppeteers. That's the moment where I'm like, yes, this film does something that previous sort of self-referential horror films don't do. It's kind of my take on it.
It's so interesting because usually the meta-ness is kind of implicit in the dialogue. Like even in Scream,
yes.
You know, it's the people talking about things, you know, that exist in their universe. But here the meta-ness is part of the plot. So there's no one acknowledging, you know, that they're part of a horror movie, but they're building a whole nother horror world that makes fun or elevates the tropes that we're very familiar with and plays around with them. So it's a completely different way of approaching kind of meta-ness, if that's even a word. But the other thing that is always kind of surprising to me is that I always forget that we start with the engineers.
Yeah.
I always like
so do I, actually.
It always hits me by surprise.
Yeah. You think the scene with we meet kind of Dana and her friends in the dorm room, and like Dana, literally first shot, Dana is in her pants through the window, like typical teen setup. They're listening to kind of, I don't know, mid 2010 music. Like that in my head is what happens first, and then we get the lab. But from the very start, you've got these, everything's on you kind of know what's you know the sort of first layer of the onion,
but you don't pay
Straight off the
attention to it.
No.
And it's kind of also, I think, a smart way of fitting, like playing around with what we expect from a slasher. And one of the things that we always expect from a slasher is like attractive teenagers, or maybe I should say attractive 27-year-olds playing teenagers.
Classic. Another classic.
And here we get like these two worker bees, Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford, by the way, you know, astounding actors in their own right, but in a very kind of West Wing type situation.
Yes.
That then suddenly gets plastered with this bright red, you know, now it's very familiar because all the Avengers movies use it. And by the way, just for context, this is also the year that the first Avengers movie came out, directed by Joss Whedon. So
yes.
that like big giant font that takes over the entire screen takes over the faces of Richard Jenkins and Bradley Whitford, who are like driving in a little golf mini cart towards their desk, just like bitching about their office days. It's very Office Space in a kind of weird underground mythological bunker. But then like we almost forget about that because they're very, you know, essentially forgettable, anonymous white dudes, worker bees, and you're like, what the fuck is this? Like, oh, whatever. I hope it doesn't come back again. But it does.
And it's like a reset, isn't it? You're suddenly, you're lured into the trap of this classic kind of setup with the teens going away to the cabin. And you do get sucked into that for a while. And there's just a few very slight references. So, you know, when they leave to go to the cabin, you've got the kind of the soldier on the roof who says they've left the nest. And you're like, every now and again, you're kind of drip fed are like, yeah, okay, just remember all is not what it seems. But actually, you're right. It's very easy to also just get pulled into this story of these teens kind of hanging out and going for a weekend away because it feels so familiar to us that I don't know, I just automatically get absorbed into it, I think.
Same. So let's talk a little bit about these teens. How do they fit into the character tropes that we expect from teen slasher movies? But also, how do they actually upend them a little bit from the very beginning of the film?
Yeah, so all of the classic tropes are there within sort of a teen slasher, but they're absolutely not what you'd expect. So, you know, we've spoken about our first meeting. It's the classic American dorm. Dana's in her pants. Her friend Jules has sort of just dyed her hair platinum blonde. She's trying to convince Dana to unpack her college books, you know, pack sexy clothes instead, all of this kind of thing. These friends are positioned to meet our expectations of these character cliches, but actually it's not what it seems at all. So they go to the cabin, and the first half of this film is kind of packed with those settings and scenes straight out of every other teen slasher. So you've got, you know, they stop off at the gas station. It's very Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They're at a cabin. It's very Evil Dead. They're away at a remote location, somewhere off the beaten track. You've got creepy paintings. You've got jumping in the lake and swimming. You've got investigating in the basement with all these strange objects and all of these things. But instead of sort of characters and settings and scenes being very hollow and cliche, the tropes exist because they play this much bigger part in a bigger story, this idea of ancient gods kind of being appeased. So these teens aren't actually like these roles. So Dana, who is sort of positioned as the virgin, the final girl, she isn't a virgin at all. We know from the outset that she's been sleeping with her college tutor. So she's not a virgin. Kurt is on full academic scholarship. He's a sociology major. Jules is a pre-med student. Marty is just a classic stoner with his keep cup bong.
Oh my God, the keep cup bong.
But, you know, he's actually very savvy and he understands more about what's going on than anything else. So all of these really classic characters, these really classic scenes are inverted in lots of subtle ways as we go along. So we've got the classic setup with these 5 friends. They all fulfill the role of the virgin, the athlete, the whore, the fool, the scholar. But we kind of know from the start that they're actually not. And when I go back and rewatch this film, I kind of notice in more subtle ways that they are really likable characters, and like they're really concerned when Marty comes out of the car and he's really stoned, and they're like, that's not okay, and we don't really want you to bring drugs like to this weekend away. Like, are you all right? You shouldn't really be doing this. And it's like, that's not a classic setup at all.
I mean, this is what makes them so interesting, right? And it again, it's one of the subtleties, because I think it's one of the things that I pick up on when I rewatch the film, because I do kind of go into this very specific set of expectations. You know, you want them to be kind of stupid. You want them to, you know, the whore to be very slutty. You're like, actually, none of these characters are stupid. None of them are black and white. They're all kind of just very regular, sensible, young adults, you know, like older teenagers or whatnot. But you know what, we kind of put them automatically into these roles even before we're given the roles that they're supposed to be fitting into, because of our built-in knowledge of slasher films, out of teen horror films. It's like, of course, you're blonde, so you're the slut. You're, you know, gazing into the distance, so you're the final girl. You're Chris Hemsworth, so you're the jock. Basically that. Like, you're built like Chris Hemsworth, so you're the jock. Doesn't matter that you're in a full academic scholarship. You're a stoner, so and look like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, so you must be the foolish comic relief, the Randy of the group who'll get killed very early on, but not the first one. And then there's Holden, who are like, oh, we're told that you're a jock.
Yes, he's absolutely the Randy, isn't he?
Yeah. So picking up on that, one of the things that I always notice when I go back to rewatch the film is actually how they change throughout the film. And I was wondering if that's something that you also notice in your rewatches of the film, like how, as the film progresses, the jock becomes more jockey. The slut becomes sluttier. The final girl becomes more virginal and meeker. The fool becomes more foolish. And, you know, and even Holden, I think, is the most unsubtle one. Kind of, he starts off as as, you know, just another like football player. And then he progressively becomes more like the scholar. So he like puts on glasses.
Yeah, he gets glasses.
Yeah.
That's how we know he's got glasses now. And he can read Latin suddenly. It's like, oh, he's got his glasses on. He's the scholar. Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of Kurt's one I always think about, because at the beginning, like, he and Jules are almost making fun of the stereotypes of the jock as well. Because, you know, Jules is like, he kind of grabs Jules's books and is like, you know, what did I say about these? You know, I'm not supposed to be reading these books. And she's like, I learned it from you. Like, they're totally making fun of that stereotype. And Kurt doesn't, there's the bit where he's had the interaction with Dana and then he says like, and you're in your pants. Like, he's not looking at her in her pants. He's kind of awkward about it. He's like, I don't want to. And then by, you know, kind of 45 minutes in, he's almost like pressuring Jules to go outside and have sex. And he's drinking loads. And Marty's the one that's like, this isn't normal for any of them. Like, they don't do this. They don't get really drunk. They're not overly horny. They don't go and bone outside on a little patch of moonlight on the grass. Like, they know not to split up. Like, all of these things are not normal for these friends. Like, they know each other very well and things are subtly changing, as you say. And that's really interesting to see. But also, I find it really interesting that there's a very profound reason why these tropes need to take place. So it's not just like, haha, funny to watch them turn into the cliches that we expect. But actually, there's this like grand narrative around why they need to be like this and why they need to make bad decisions, because it serves a greater purpose.
And on that note, actually, the other batch of characters that we're given to engage with are the engineers. And I always think that they don't have names, but they do have names. Their names are Steve and Gary, which is
Steve and Gary.
very, very much like, you know, white collar workers in a massive organization.
It's really hard to remember their names because they're so generic. It's like, what is Richard? Gary, of course. It's going to be like a Gary or a Nigel or Gary and Steve. A classic, yes, the facility technicians.
So alongside our group of teenagers who we're engaging with, but at the same time, we've got Gary and Steve, who we spend quite a lot of time with as the movie progresses. What do you make of them and their banter, I guess?
They're the best bit for me. They actually are. And just the more I see them, the more I love them. In all of their, with all of their great flaws when they're talking about Steve's poor wife at the beginning and he's kind of moaning about her in a, but they're cogs in a corporate machine, aren't they? They're these regular, as you say, like, they're these regular guys. They're trying to make it through the day at their desks. And they're bantering in a way that, there's a lot of office banter. And so much of that is familiar in, a very stereotypical way that it's funny. But there's the kind of darker side to it as well, in that they're kind of pretty immune to the job that they're doing. So they're doing a very everyday role for them, but also it's a role that very much inflicts pain and suffering on someone else, and they're just completely immune to it at this stage. It's something that it's a job that they've got to get done for what they've been told is a greater good. So it's a really interesting dynamic, I think.
I mean, one of the things that I love kind of rewatching it is I think that it's very akin to horror fandom in a way.
Yes.
In that way of kind of the things that seem the most extreme or horrific or pushing boundaries, moral, societal, bodily, whatever.
Yeah.
Then become kind of part of this very fun board game almost. And I'm not saying that the facility or whatever approaches as a board game, but I'm looking at an actual screenshot of the board that they have, the office betting system that they have as to which monster will win. And I'm like, it's a way of sort of, these things that are so horrific, these stories and these monsters that are so horrifying to so many people, they become so quotidian and so mundane and so very much like,
so right.
Oh, witches or sexy witches, hell lords or, giant snakes, the mummy or the merman.
Always the merman. I'm with Steve.
Never
No, you're right. It's
merman.
like the murder. There is literal torture and murder and sex and these crazy, insane monsters. And this is all just like a walk in the park for them. Like, they're more interested in placing bets and talking at the vending machine about like what they're doing at the weekend. Like, you're right. It's so everyday, isn't it? Like, for us, that I could talk about this kind of thing all the time and everyone else would probably think I'm insane. But everyone else who's really into horror films is going to be like, yeah, I find watching a lot of this stuff to be quite a comfort sometimes. So yeah, really, really strange.
So what do you make of with the teenagers? Going back to the teenagers, we're going to be going back and forth between Steve and Gary and the teenagers. So when the teenagers are in their slasher movie, and they follow essentially all the beats of a slasher movie as are laid out for them. In a kind of choose your own adventure vibe, because they get to pick up objects, and based on what object they interact with, they will get one type of slasher movie and they will get another type of slasher movie. I love this movie, but one of the things that I find interesting as I rewatch it, I remember thinking more of it as a slasher movie. It falls into these things. They're in the cabin in the woods. They're in the dark. They're getting drunk. They're touching some weird diary. They read something out in Latin. All bad ideas. We know these are bad ideas. There's monsters. People get killed. They're getting murdered. Obviously, Jules dies first because she's the whore. And kind of they react to that. But every time I rewatch it, and on this recent rewatch, I'm like, those are the bits that work the least for me, because I'm watching them with like a triple distance. Not only do I know the tropes of the slasher films and the films that they're trying to imitate, but also I'm now so much more invested in the commentary by Steve and Gary, where I'm like, yeah, but I cannot wait for the cutaway to Steve and Gary making fun of the teenagers making the dumb slasher movie mistake, as opposed to actually caring that much about whether they get killed or not. And I was wondering if the horror film that the teenagers are in actually works for you within Cabin in the Woods.
I know exactly what you mean. It kind of harks back to this idea of sort of the film being like a love-hate letter to the genre, which is just something Joss Whedon said, like this idea of kind of we're kind of celebrating, and you know, we love being scared, we love rooting for characters and wanting them to sort of face this, you know, all of these jump scares and creepy monsters, but actually kind of unpacking them in the way that it does really taps into the fact that there are lots of cliches and storylines and kind of character tropes that are maybe feeling a bit stale and a bit old. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the idea of sort of kids acting like idiots and the violence, it's like a film that very much pokes fun at those cliches, especially the teens making the bad decisions, and it gives this kind of, I guess, the grander mythos and the reason behind to sort of I don't know, it gives it a background that we don't usually have to these kinds of films. It's sort of, and yeah, I think for me, you're right. The lab setup is much more refreshing, and it is where the kind of the I don't know, that's the refreshing part for me. And the cabin stuff is kind of funny, and it is enjoyable. But as you say, I'm very aware of it kind of unpacking the ways that the genre maybe has been relying on these kind of cliches and things for too long. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think even as you were talking, I was thinking back on the film. I was like, actually, the only moment when the actual horror story that's within the facility's plans starts really working for me is when Marty and Dana discover the facility. That's when it becomes unexpected. And and you know, I said I don't remember watching the film for the first time, but I do remember the feeling of that shift happening and being like, what the fuck is going to happen? This is unknown territory. I have never seen this before, and I have no idea how it's going to end. And that is exciting.
Yeah, and poking fun at those cliches within the cabin is fun, but again, that is something that we've done before as well. So like with a film like Scream, like we're an audience that knows that these, you know, these ideas, these tropes, these kind of beat by beat cookie cutter things are kind of funny but silly, and you know, we know, we have like a lot of knowledge about them, I guess. So you're right, when we reach the facility, that's the bit where everything changes. And it's also the facility for me that is the moments of real tension and kind of horror in this film are actually in the facility for me rather than in the cabin. So when the red phone rings, for example, when they're all celebrating because they think they've pretty much got to the end, and that red phone rings, like that is a real moment of tension. It's very dark when the tunnel doesn't blow and they're kind of freaking out, and Steve and Gary are like, you know, like, we've fucked it, we're in big trouble. Like, that is very tense for me. And it's a lot more effective and affecting than the scenes with the teens, I think. So that was something I hadn't quite noticed on earlier viewings, is the points that are really sort of edge of the seat for me in this, and that are actually very dark, are those moments within the very sterile kind of corporate setup. I think about that horrible moment where they're celebrating whilst Dana's in the background kind of battling for her life on the screen with the zombie redneck guy. Like, she's literally been demoted to the background because it's kind of not that interesting for us. And everyone's celebrating in the front. And I mean, that's like fucking dark. Like, those are the moments that really stick with me on sort of repeat viewing.
You're so right about that shot. I kind of made a note of that shot because I was like, oh, wow. Oh, this is me when I'm like cooking and watching a horror film on my laptop, like
that's
on the fridge.
That's literally me. Yes. I prop it up on my celebrations box, and I do my cooking, and people are literally being hacked apart in the background, and I'm like, la 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 la.
It is, you know, I felt, you know, to use the parlance of the internet, I felt very personally attacked by that scene.
Rude. I don't know what they're trying to say. It's a weird dynamic, actually, because I think the setup for this film, on one level, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as well, you know, there's this idea that the audience is the ancient, you know, we're the ancient gods. And we're having to ask, you know, we want to be appeased with all of these kind of, you know, we're watching this for entertainment and the sex and the violence. But also there are times where I see myself very much in Gary and Steve as well. And then there are also times where I see myself in Marty, especially when he's walking around going like, what the fuck are you all doing? Like, why are we doing this? This is so stupid. It's like, yes, that's me as well. And I kind of see myself in every layer. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's also kind of the point and the joy of this film, and the rewatchable element of it. It's not so much the Easter eggs and the references, which we will kind of talk a little bit in a moment, but it's the fact that all the layers of it work for, you know, for horror fans, as a horror film, as a meta horror film, as a comedy. And you can sort of attach yourself and see yourself in so many different behaviors from characters and from the whole film without necessarily just it always being the same one. So you can like jump ship within the duration of this film. And I love you kind of saying that the you know, we the audience are kind of like the ancient ones. We're the ones that need to be appeased by the facility. But let's talk a little bit about the facility itself. Like, what is this world? This the office politics of this underground, like Truman Show-esque lab, and this idea of the human sacrifices that they need to make every year to the ancient ones.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very Buffy setup, isn't it? I remember an initial viewing being like, wow, Dana and Marty have tapped into the initiative. Like, this is where they are. We're going to see Riley Finn and it's all going to,
no, Riley, please. Absolutely
no. Absolutely no. Poor Riley. Absolutely. That's a whole other episode, but good
Riley
Lord.
needs to be less boring, so no poor Riley from me.
Is the worst boyfriend of all, truly. So sorry. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, is this a film about teens being stalked and murdered in the woods? Or is it a film about a bunch of white-collar engineers serving a bunch of powerful overlords, having to do a job which causes great harm to other people? And that's kind of what I'm edging towards nowadays. I'm like, no, this is actually a film about Steve and Gary, and it's really interesting, and something that I also, there's this grand idea, like the metaphor of, as we were discussing, you've got the puppets, so you've got the teens, the kind of the actors on the film set almost. You've got Gary and Steve, who are almost like Whedon and Goddard themselves, maneuvering the puppets to keep the viewers happy. And then you've got these ancient gods who are us, the horror viewers who just want to be entertained. And there's this grand metaphor there about this, which is like really, that is interesting, but also I'm sort of a bit obsessed with the capitalist undertones of this film as well. Like the idea of these engineers just doing a job, and their job happens to be murdering innocent people. And I know that Goddard kind of grew up in the like the home of the atomic bomb, essentially, and he said he was talking about sort of watching these kind suburban men go to work making these weapons of mass destruction. And that, I don't know, I spent a lot of time for some reason on this viewing, probably because of the state of the world today as well, thinking about how these engineers are actually quite desensitized to the evil that they see on the screen, and they've, you know, they're part of a system and they're doing this for the greater for good. So I ended up spending a lot of time thinking about people having to work for a system or of an institution that is telling you that you're doing something for the greater good, which is probably not the point of this film, but actually that was something that, I don't know, I spent a lot of time thinking about this week.
It's really interesting, and I hadn't even thought about it in that way, but you're absolutely on point. Like, it is that element of, you know, the banality of evil. Like, it's not always, you know, mustache twirling Dr. Evil type people who do evil things. It's very often, because it's not always just one person or even a group of people, it's systems and institutions, and this is one. And they talk so much about, you know, the greater good, the fact that these sacrifices are these human sacrifices and these things that they do are essentially there to save the entire planet. So in a way, the film is also kind of telling us to look at Gary and Steve as the real heroes of the cabin in the woods, because they're the ones who are trying to save the entire planet with their work.
Yeah.
Whether it's Marty and Dana, when they survive and ultimately also survive and basically choose to condemn the entire planet to die because they don't want to die. Like, they're actually they're the villains because they end the entire planet.
Yeah.
But we're still also rooting for them.
You're rooting for them both, aren't you? And this is one of the things I came across in like, looking on Reddit was like just an argument about like, who's the villain here? It's clearly Dana and Marty, but like, is it because Gary and Steve are trying to save the world? Yes, but actually, is murdering people for the greater good? I don't know. Is that always the right thing to do? Are they being caught up in a system and, it's not their fault, but are they the heroes if they're sort of maintaining the status quo in this way because they've been told that something worse will happen if they don't do this? On the flip side, you're absolutely right. Dana and Marty are being very selfish because they're picking themselves over the rest of humanity. But also, if you tell me that I have to pick society over my friends, I'm also likely to tell you to go fuck yourself. So I don't know. They're kind of they're both the heroes and the villains.
Yeah, and also as an audience, isn't it so much more satisfying to get that absolute fuck you ending where a giant hand pops up from the floor and just grabs the cabin in the woods? It's so much. And it's also extremely satisfying to see our teenage heroes kind of go fuck the system and we're gonna go up in flames and we're gonna burn. It's like a very Fight Club ending in a way where everything is breaking down and being and imploding, but you're kind of like, well, I don't disagree.
Yeah, I
somewhat I like
agree.
one. So, and at the same time, like if they didn't win and the facility won and Dana did shoot Marty and the gods were at peace, it would also be a satisfying ending. So actually, like there is no way to end this in an unsatisfactory way, which is kind of amazing for a story, isn't it?
It is. You're right, but for me, I love this ending, and I love the fact that it happens the way it does, because again, it's toying with our expectations. When it comes to sacrifice, especially in filmmaking, we are expected that, the final girl, the people left at the end, they will make their sacrifice for the good of mankind. And that's what we're taught, that's what sacrifice is. And they've kind of, Marty says at the beginning, like, society needs to crumble, fuck it, like, and I really respect that. And also, talking about sort of the tropes of like teen slasher horror, and this film being something that's very nudge kind of wink the idea of society needing to crumble is the status quo of horror filmmaking. Maybe that needs to crumble, and all of these tropes and these cliches that we have, like, they're pretty fun, we enjoy them, but actually now is the time to start something new. Maybe we need to let all of this crumble and fall to the floor. Let's give someone else a chance. Let's do something different in our horror filmmaking. So that's the other element, of course.
It's very, in a way, Lovecraftian, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It's very much there's these unknowable ancient beings that we can never control, but we can only sort of tame mildly. And
yes,
but it's kind of making you think about, oh well, this planet now like one part of this giant cosmic ecosystem, and it doesn't really matter all that much. And like Marty says, maybe someone else can have a turn now at this planet because we kind of ruined it. So maybe we should just leave.
Yeah, we shouldn't, like, is this a good thing that we're doing? Now we're stuck in this weird, we're enabling all these horrible things to take place. Like, and this is just one ritual, isn't it? This is just the American ritual. There are so many other rituals happening across the world. Yes. So actually we are punishing and murdering quite a lot of people. Yes. Like, maybe that does need to crumble. Maybe we need to give someone else a chance, because we're not, we think we're heroes, but maybe we're not doing a nice thing.
And, you know, we've kind of delved into the capitalist and existential elements of the Cabin in the Woods, but I want to kind of talk about the fun kills.
Yes.
So we talked about the ending of the whole...
Sorry, I got too serious.
No, I love it. I mean, we can do both here. We can get existential and we can get goofy. So... What, you know, we were talking about the ending, and I want to kind of talk about the way that some of these characters end, because I think within the overall structure of the film, each individual character also has their perfect finale, and I wanted to touch on them and kind of which one of the ends of each character, which one of the deaths did you enjoy the most?
Oh, but they are all brilliant. They are very good, aren't they? There's, I mean, for me, Kurt's death will always stay with me, and it's something that I almost forget until kind of like 15 seconds beforehand. Like, oh, fucking hell, because he's, you know, he was a very intelligent, quite sensitive, seemed quite like a lovely guy. And now he's this big muscular football jock that just wants to have sex outdoors and get really drunk and just be a bit of a jerk. And he reaches this point where he's like, I'm going to save the whole thing because I'm, you know, I'm the athlete. I'm the muscle. I'm the big hero. I'm going to ride my bike. I'm going to go and get some big fucking guns, and I'm going to come back and save everyone. And then he just smacks into this force field like, I don't know. It's like a full splat, isn't it? In a way that I forget just how sudden and how cruel it is when it happens. Like, it's a real shocker.
It's just, I mean, and I think that scene is just beautiful. It's just comedic perfection. It's shocking, and it does, like, it's one of the first, well, it's not one of the first, but it's one of the major, I think, twists in a film that is full of twists, where you're like, oh shit, these worlds are about to collide. They're actively colliding. Yeah. These characters should not have seen that happen, basically.
No, exactly. You're right. It's all, again, our expectation of, we know things aren't quite right, and you expect him not to make it, I think. You're like, he's going to probably just, like, you know, he's not going to make the jump, basically. He'll fall down like, something like that will happen. They will manipulate the environment in some way to stop him from being able to leave. But then he hits that force field, and Marty and Dana now know. Not Marty and Dana. Dana and Holden know. Like, they are literally shown that something far more nefarious is going on, and they are told up front that something very strange is happening and that they are being forced to stay there. You're right. It's very, again, it's like very upfront. Those worlds collide in a way that you just absolutely do not expect, because you think they will be kept in the dark about what is happening for a lot longer.
Absolutely. And then one of the things that I really appreciate about all the deaths is that every single character that is named, essentially, that we're introduced to, even if they're sort of tertiary characters, they all get a significant ending. I mean, I've sort of alluded to it before. My very favorite one is Steve's death, Bradley Whitford, who dies by merman.
And that's the best one.
Dramatic one as well, where the merman just appears out of this foggy, bloodshed that's happening in the facility, and Bradley Whitford is just like, oh, come on.
It's so beautifully poetic, isn't it? I love the merman. When you'd messaged me about this and we were organising like a time to talk about this film, I was like, I'm so excited to talk about the merman, because we're all deeply invested in that extremely strange monster. And apparently the merman was like at the top of test audiences' reasons for liking the film, which I really enjoy, because it too is the top reason that I enjoy this film. But you're right, there's that's kind of peppered throughout, isn't it? That Steve's like, I just really want to see this merman, and then it's flirted with because Kurt's got the conch, and he's like, am I going to blow in it? And then you're rooting for this merman scenario. I don't know how that scenario would work in any. I feel like people would like, how would the merman? It just wouldn't work. But so pleased and horrified for Steve that that's the way he goes, and it's that moment with the blowhole that it's disgusting. It's I don't know. It brings great
think,
joy and great disgust at the same time.
As someone with a very documented, I'm not gonna say fetish, it's like cinematic fetish. Like I just
Okay.
want to see more mer creatures on screen.
Okay.
Is what I'm saying. I want more live action mermaid shit. I want more live action merman shit. Like that. It makes me so happy. I am Bradley Whitford. I am the person who's constantly, completely unprovoked, bemoaning the lack of live action mermaid movies.
We need more mermaid, don't we?
Like,
Absolutely.
I
thought you were going to say you had a documented. I thought you were going to say you had a documented fetish for blowholes. I was like, I didn't know about this.
That is
This is
not
news to me.
That is not for this podcast, and that is not
I'm
a sentence.
so sorry, everyone.
That is not a sentence I expected to hear today.
Cut that one out.
That's staying in. That's 100% staying in. But though it's just I so connect with Bradley Whitford's character in this film because I just love how that joke is peppered through the entire film, and then it pays off. Every single
it's a
joke
beautiful payoff.
pays off.
Yeah. You're so right. Yeah. That's the best death. I can't believe I started wanging on about Kurt when we had that death to talk about. But no, you are right.
And let's talk a little bit about the monsters because they're options, right? We get a bit of the merman, we get a lot of the zombie redneck torture family, we get a little bit of the, oh my god, who else do we get? We get a little bit more mutant zombies, I guess, but
we get quite a lot of well, there's quite a lot of screen time for werewolf and bat as well. They get a bit of
you're right
time. There are so many options though, aren't there? And as you say, there's like it is a choose your own adventure when they're in the basement. They could pick anything, and I'm sort of mad that Dana decided to read from the diary of all things. It's like, come on now, that's definitely one of the least interesting of the. I actually, for the record, I actually really like the redneck. What is it? The redneck torture? No.
Zombie redneck torture family.
That's it. Zombie redneck torture family. It's a very specific way of saying it. The Buckners. I actually do have time for them, and I do think they're quite creepy. And they're like this nice love child of sort of Evil Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, aren't they? But yeah, all of the potentials is just the mind just reels. All of these other potentials we could have had is just that's part of the fun of it, I think, is actually imagining the spin-offs that we could have had.
Absolutely. And we get this, one of the most famous shots of Cabin in the Woods is kind of Dana and Marty going down in this elevator, and they're just surrounded by these glass boxes full of monsters. And each monster, in a way, is also kind of a reference or an allusion to either very famous horror films, like the Deadites are basically the Cenobites from Hellraiser. You get these kind of like zombies, you get mutants, you get werewolves, you get witches, you get like a hell lord who's basically Pinhead.
Yeah.
You get like these vampires. Like there's one that looks a lot like Samara from Ringu.
Yes, there's a mixture of like very generic monster type, like kind of vampire, goblin, werewolf, but then very specific references. So on the whiteboard they've got angry molesting tree, which is a specific Evil Dead reference. There is only one angry molesting tree that I'm aware of. And I'm trying to think of other, well, kind of like the masks that are very Strangers-esque, and then you've got the twins in the cube that are like The Shining. So there's very specific references and then also very generic references, which is kind of fun. But the lift scene is just like a very cathartic payoff, isn't it? It's so much it's just so much fun.
And kind of on this referential element of the film, like that's one of the joys of it, isn't it? And it's been kind of described as a puzzle game for horror fans. Kind of do you find it kind of enjoyable do you find this element of the film enjoyable, the fact that there's so many references and that people have taken so much joy in both trying to find them, pinpoint them, spot the reference, spot all the Easter eggs, but also at the same time it's kind of making fun of the of us for enjoying doing that.
It is. Yeah, I think there's a twofold thing here. So I think horror fans, including the makers of films like this, I think we fully acknowledge the greats that came before us, and we like to honor our own ancient gods in a way. So like the Halloweens, the Texas Chainsaw Massacres, the things that made the genre what it is today, we love to pay tribute to them. So we kind of love an Easter egg in that respect. Like, this is the biggest bowl of eggs I think the genre, like films have ever seen. There is pretty much everything in it. And so I think there's part of this which is acknowledging the greats, and that's why we really love to see them pop up all the time. And I'm amazed at the level of detail about this film that you can find on the internet. Like, there are very, very detailed breakdowns of every single monster, when they appear, their mythology, what they might allude to. It's crazy. Like, there's it's basically like a whole Wikipedia of various articles breaking down every single monster, some of which I have never caught on screen. Like, I don't think I could even screenshot and find them. It's absolutely insane. We're very, very clever people, and we're very, very knowledgeable. So I think we love to honor the things that came before us and the classics. We also, we know a lot, so we love to kind of put our knowledge to the test. But also I think we don't take everything too seriously. So, with the cliches and the monsters, the cookie cutter monsters in particular, like, we know the cliches, we know they're silly, and I think we know how to make fun of things in a very tongue-in-cheek way, in a way that's very loving at the same time. So we can acknowledge that scenes like this are completely ridiculous, completely silly, but that's part of the fun of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we're such a great community as well. We know our shit. We also know how to have a laugh. And that's why I regard this film as a celebration more than a serious critique, because it's something to discuss with your friends, isn't it? It's something to have a laugh about, and to be like, I love these bits. This stuff is completely ridiculous, but I always have time for it. It's that kind of, it's just so much fun.
It's interesting because, and I think I sent you a part of this, but I really loved Roger Ebert's review of this film, because he has this whole, setting off point of like, is this a horror film, or is this like a puzzle piece? And he calls it this final exam for fanboys in his review, but he also, which is a great line, and it's very true, but he also asked, like, in hearing you speak, Ebert in his review is asking, like, is this film itself an act of criticism? And I think, we always think about film criticism as, this like dire, dense, hyper intellectual act of thinking. And, it is, and it can be, but it does not necessarily mean that it cannot be fun. If we're going to compare The Cabin in the Woods and think of it as like a piece of criticism, I think that also tracks, because not just because of the conversations that it contains, but also the conversations that it then spawns. Like, you mentioning all these breakdowns on articles. And I was watching a few video essays by creators that I like about this film. And I'm like, oh, you've got like a very different reading from it than I do. And in some places we align, in some places we don't. And the fact that it can talk about horror, and it can, create a story that works, but also a story that lives on like at least 3 different levels within the same film, but also incorporate references that are known, but also not the point. So when I think of like very meta things like Ready Player One, which is a obscene book, and the adaptation is just shit. But it's I think that's a bad example of the sort of act that I think The Cabin in the Woods succeeds in making of itself. Like, it is criticism in a sense where like it is so knowing about a genre, but it is so knowing about how the genre uses storytelling that it can actually tell a compelling story without ignoring and actually posing quite a few questions and making statements as well about the genre as a whole, which is quite difficult to achieve. Like, you have to be very, very knowledgeable, but also come from a place of understanding as opposed to mockery. Like, it's a comedy, but it's not a spoof at all. I don't think
Yes.
it's spoofing the horror genre. I think those references that we talk about, the like the Cenobites, the molesting tree, all those things, it's just winks. I don't think they necessarily add to the story, but they're a way of like dropping in influences. It's like, when you talk to a filmmaker and you kind of talk about what they were watching when they were drawing inspiration and when they were working on a film. And very often, not always, but very often, they'll have like these lists. And sometimes those lists are very unexpected because they'll be drawing from some references for, the visual language of the film. They'll be drawing on other references for performances. They'll be drawing on a completely different set of references for like the tone or the story and the script of it. And this is how I think about this film as well. It's like I can see the different batches of things that have influenced The Cabin in the Woods. And what's really, I think what's really makes it an act of criticism is that it puts them in the text, but it's sort of, they're like footnotes.
Yes. Yeah, you're completely right. And I'd be interested to know, to have someone who's like not particularly knowledgeable about horror or who, doesn't watch a lot of horror films, what they get out of this film as well, because I think you could still really enjoy it. And I don't think it needs to feel like a test in that the as you say, like the makers of this film aren't saying like, we're so very clever and how much of this can you understand or how much of this you can guess. Like it doesn't, I feel like it brings the audience along with it, and it knows that we're all very knowledgeable and that we love this kind of thing, and it doesn't patronize us in that way. But I'd be really interested to know if people who aren't as into horror would watch this and get a lot out of it. And I think they still would. I think there's still like a real enjoyment factor, and that you could have like a quite subtle knowledge of the genre and still sort of understand what it's trying to do to an extent. And I don't think you have to. I think if you can understand all of the, if you pull apart all of the different elements, that's really, really satisfying. But you also don't have to if that's not your thing.
I think that's the biggest challenge of a film like this, isn't it? I mean, the same, when I said at the beginning of our chat that I think this is as good of a meta horror as Scream is. This is one of the reasons why, because I think that same as Scream, it works without the meta thing, and it works in a different way with the meta thing. Yeah. And I think that's the kind of the challenge. It's the same as, say, this is the same test that I kind of applied to any Marvel movie, right? Like a Marvel movie really succeeds, in my opinion, when it works for 3 types of audiences. Yeah. When it works for someone who's coming into that movie as an individual standalone piece of work, they're not, necessarily engaged with the previous decade plus of content that Marvel has put out, which all forms part of the same cinematic universe. B, it works for people who are a part of that conversation and have, want another episode in the MCU. And C, it works for people who not only like are engaged with the cinematic universe, but also engaged with the extended kind of, the comic book universe of it. So you kind of have to satisfy 3 audiences with 3 very different types of demands. Yeah. And now, digging my heels into this idea of Cabin in the Woods as an act of horror film criticism as well, as a piece of entertainment too, I think it works on that level too. Like as a film critic, if you watch it and if you're familiar with horror, you can appreciate kind of on that level. And similarly, if you're an audience member and you're reading a piece of criticism from a film critic, you kind of need to be able to read it before you watch the film to help you make a decision whether you want to watch it or not, whether you want to spend your time with it. B, maybe read it after you've watched the film and gain some new insight or some new context from it that you did not have when you were going into the film. And C, also enjoy it as a piece of writing, as a piece of non-fiction, writing craft, which, demands that the film critic actually knows how to string a sentence or 2 together. So I have now completely I'm digging my heels into this idea of that Roger Ebert kind of asked himself in his review of like, is The Cabin in the Woods a piece of film criticism? And I'd say it is. Yeah.
I think I completely agree with you. I think you're right. It is. I like the fact that you can sort of engage with it on different levals. And there are things that got out of it watching this week that I might not forget about, but that they might not sit at the forefront for me with the subsequent viewing. And I don't think that matters. Like, I've kind of got something out of it every time.
And what were some of the things that you got out of it kind of this time round?
Well, there was definitely, again, thinking about this, probably because of the context and the state of the world today, I found those underground lab elements, and thinking about sort of the position that Steve and Gary have been put in by, you know, the director, by everyone above them. I felt a lot sadder for them in a way that I don't think I've paid as much attention to in the past. And also, yeah, I guess in the past I've spent a lot of time wanting to get to the lift scene because it's a lot of fun and a real celebration. And this time, yeah, maybe that wasn't sitting at the forefront as the not most important part of the film to me, but I think I spent a bit more time kind of savoring some of the acts of criticism and some of the more subtle elements of the film, rather than the very loud lift scene that goes on for about 10 minutes and is just a bloodbath. I
mean, we've gone very highbrow, but let's talk about the bloodbath, because those final 10 minutes after Marty and Dana kind of come out of the lift, holy fucking shit.
It just doesn't let up, does it? It's pretty intense.
It's kind of amazing, because I don't know, did you feel this way as well, where I kind of felt very desensitized and didn't really care that much when our main teen characters were being killed off, because it fits so much in the expected gore.
We're so used to that.
When the lift scene happened, I was like, oh my god, I don't even know which way to look, because everyone's getting murdered in a different way in every single corner of the screen.
Yes, so many creative options there, isn't there? Yeah, no, you're completely right. Like, the teens are actually very, I think they're actually very likable. And I'm sort of rooting for them, but also when they die, I'm not surprised. And it's kind of, and some of them, I will admit, are quite forgettable. So like Holden in particular is not a very interesting person. And I think sometimes we have this in teen slashers, like we'll have a group of people, and you know, those sort of main characters, those heroes, really, some of them really aren't that interesting. So he dies, I don't really give a shit. And then the lift scene in particular is complete mayhem and so fun to watch, and is where the sort of creativity truly takes flight, and then everything from there on is just completely insane.
And it's funny you mentioned that kind of we don't really give a shit about the teen characters. I don't know about you. The one character I did shit about throughout the entire film, and especially after he reappears, is Marty.
Well, this is the question I will ask you, Anna. Who is the final girl? Is it Dana or is it Marty?
Well, technically it's Dana, isn't it? I mean, this is also very much following the Scream format, right? Like, there's not just one person who survives. Dana is the designated final girl, but Randy also survives in Scream. And Marty is the Randy. He's the know-it-all. He's not the fool.
Exactly. And I was rooting for Marty more than Dana. Sorry, Dana.
Same.
And he's also very knowledgeable. And I'm rooting for him more. He might be a virgin. We're not entirely sure. I was thinking about this. I was like, we don't know if Marty's done it. We know he's dated Jules before, but they just made out a little bit. Maybe Marty's the final girl. Who knows? But he is the one that you're rooting for, though, isn't it? Because again, he's kind of partially us as the audience, and he's also hilarious. He's the one kind of character within the teen group that is legitimately hilarious. Like, he's got so many good one-liners.
Honestly.
He's so good.
The moment when he finds the cables in the cabin and he's just looking around like, puppets. We're all puppets.
The puppets. He says something about being in a womb of reefer that makes me laugh every time. He's like, I live in a womb of reefer or something like that. It just makes me laugh every time. He's very, very likable. The stoner nerd. He knows, as you say, he is our Randy. He's the conspiracy nut. He's aware of these tropes. He's questioning everything that's going on. He's the one that kind of breaks the lamp and finds the bug, so he breaks that kind of wall, the divide between the two worlds. And he's also essentially saved by his own dope, because whatever he's smoking has basically been stopping all of the outside sort of environmental elements from impacting on him.
True.
So he's just, he's great. After Gary and Steve, Marty is my,
I mean, if anything, he makes this a pro-weed movie, basically, because his weed is the thing that saves him from being completely manipulated.
It's saving everyone, right? It's actually saved him from being the dummy in many respects. So this is a pro-weed movie.
So as we're nearing towards the end of our chat, I wanted to kind of break down the ending, because there's like several endings within the ending. And
yes,
we kind of have to talk about the director of the facility, because that was another, what the fuck moment when the doors open up and in the sacrificial tomb, Sigourney Weaver appears in a power suit straight off the set of Political Animals.
Hot, just extremely hot. The power, the icon. It's a beautiful moment, isn't it? And I don't think I clocked on first watching. I don't think I clocked it was like, because we have the voiceover first, don't we? We have her voiceover. She's talking about the need for this to kind of happen, and let's just get it over with, and all of these kinds of things. I don't think I clocked it was her until I saw her personally.
Same.
But but also her role is the director. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Is she the director of the film? Is she the higher power coming down? She's the sort of the puppeteer, but who works for the ancient gods, isn't she? So she's on a very on the nose level, the fact that she's the director.
I kind of love I know that some people have criticized that scene for basically being an exposition dump. And it is that. It is an exposition dump.
Well,
it kind of still works for me. I think because Sigourney Weaver, number one, and two, because
it's so good,
it doesn't go the way that anybody expects it to go.
Do you know what? I hadn't even thought of it as an expedition dump. Like, I don't think that had I hadn't sat there during viewing and gone like, oh yeah, this is the bit where that actually hadn't occurred to me, really. So if it doesn't ring as an expedition dump to me, then maybe that it isn't, as you say. And the fact that it doesn't go to plan, and we think that we have Dana turning on Marty briefly, don't we? It looks like she's going to do the quote unquote right thing. She's going to sacrifice Marty and, to save the rest of humankind. And she's going to sort of play into this big, maintain the status quo and play into this big structure and do what needs to be done. And she doesn't. They decide, fuck it, for whatever reason, they're not going to accept their fate as a sacrifice. And they're going to sort of, they're going to see where things go. But I think it's a brilliant ending. I really like it. I don't know. Have you ever got the sense that people don't like the ending, or they wanted it to be something different?
Well, I don't know, because actually I don't think I've spoken to many humans about this film, outside of our,
Oh, an honor.
Outside of this is the longest that I've spoken kind of to someone else about it. I've read a lot about it and I've spoken kind of briefly, but you know how you talk to your friends who are horror fans or film fans, you're like, yes, I love this film, yes, and this bit and this bit and that bit. That's why I love podcasting. It's because you can get real deep and existential about films. It's not because I don't have friends. I do, I promise.
I believe you.
But I just I don't know, and frankly, I do not care for people who do not enjoy this ending. People are allowed to have their opinions, and we can fight about them.
But they are wrong,
They are incorrect, yes, this is a fact. But, and I think I put this in my notes to you as well, I think there's something really wild about this ending, about the appearance of the director, the death of the director, Marty and Dana kind of basically lighting up a joint and be like, yeah, well, we're all gonna die.
Fuck it.
And then the hand. I mean, it's the hand that does it for me. Yeah. It's the fact that it's such a definitive, oh no, the world is ending. Bye.
Yeah. And also, like I was saying, I was kind of like, they're being told by this group of people that actually you need to sacrifice yourself. Like, you need to do this for the greater good. And I would argue until that point, you're kind of like, I mean, I would be suspicious of that. If someone's telling me it's for a greater good that I don't know about, and there's, you know, some ancient gods sleeping beneath me that are going to wake up, I'm like, okay, you're telling me that, but I don't actually know that. So I just have to trust that this is the right thing, and I'm not going to do that. Like, it's, you know, having to, again, it's that idea of being sort of manipulated and being told that something's for the greater good when you don't know necessarily if it is for the greater good. So you're like, actually, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to stop this whole power play, playing into this structure, having to be a puppet for someone else. And then with that hand at the end, it's like, no, actually, they were telling the truth. It's fucked. now you've let everything crumble, and actually, yeah, you fucked it.
Which is just such a beautiful final slap.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, you thought we were kidding? You thought you were going to get a little cabin in the woods too? No,
yeah,
you're not.
Absolutely no. There are no sequels. Sequels are overrated too. So maybe that's what there's an element of finality to this, which is brilliant. And it is that idea of society needs to crumble, as Marty says. Like, the makers of this film are kind of saying, you know, these tropes, these kind of the things that we're so reliant on, the overuse of violence and sex, like, maybe that needs to crumble. We have fully finished this off now. There is no way to come back from the end of the world. What are you going to do next? What are you going to build that's something new? We're giving people a fresh starting point. So what are you going to do? You cannot come back from this and try and spin it out and make it into something else.
It's the horror genre eating itself.
It is literally eating itself, and what happens after that. And I think it's kind of interesting as well. I was thinking about the legacy of this film, because I love this film, but there is no sequel to it. No one has attempted to continue Cabin in the Woods 2, anything like that. Did it change horror forever? It kind of didn't.
No, it didn't.
But
I don't think any film that sets out expecting to change anything actually gets to change anything.
No. I think you're probably right, yeah.
The things that ultimately have a big effect on a genre or a style, I guess, are the things that get rewatched, that get like this, you know, this obsessive, dedicated fandom to them. And also, you know, that fit, there's no way of predicting it. You can only kind of see it sometimes if you're really attentive while it's happening, but most of the time in hindsight, when you can see that people were sharing a certain sensibility, and you can see that in the work that comes out from very different types of filmmakers.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, and it's not linked to this film, as in I don't think this as a result of this film this happened, but it's interesting that after this film and the subsequent sort of the 10 years we've just had, there's this idea of the rise of sort of quote unquote elevated horror. So we've started using horror to talk, and horror has always done this, but in a way that we're talking about sort of very real difficult topics in a not a more transparent way, but there have been a lot of films about grief and loss and sexuality and racism. So I think there's still a place for sort of tongue-in-cheek and meta horror filmmaking, but I also do kind of feel weirdly like if I drew a line under this film and kind of went forward, there are more filmmakers now that are trying to do something like more human with this genre. I don't know if that makes sense in me saying that, but does that make sense to you? I'm not saying it's as a result of this film, but it's kind of, I think this film probably does occupy a window of time in which it was almost like a slightly closed chapter, and this is the next chapter kind of going forward.
Well, I do think that, you know, I'm even looking at the list of films that I've got kind of coming up, and the films that were coming out around the same time that we haven't yet discussed. But, you know, there's another episode before that, but I'm going to cover It Follows, which is 2014.
Yeah.
And that is that shift, stylistic, thematic shift of like, this is no longer the type of flavor of teen horror that we've been used to for the previous, 20 years. And I think, I'm not sure that you can prescribe, this is the effect of The Cabin in the Woods.
No.
But it does feel, to your point, and I really agree that it does feel like a full stop.
Yeah,
like,
feels like we've closed the chapter.
Yeah.
And films like the kind of the Saw-esque hostel, like Lionsgate style kind of, again, very overly violent, graphic kind of filmmaking. I mean, obviously there will always be a subgenre of that filmmaking, and a lot of it's, that's still there, but it does feel like, again, that kind of, it was like a chapter closed around this time, and this new chapter has kind of opened, which I find, it's like, as you say, like it kind of is a full stop. It's not, this film didn't change the genre, but it occupies very much that period of time there. I think we were maybe reaching sort of a climax point or an end of that style of filmmaking. Yeah,
because even at this time, there's Warm Bodies, which comes out like a year later in 2014, which is also kind of a little bit meta, but it's more about zombies, like zombies and teens. I mean, there's Shaun of the Dead, of course, which also is incredibly meta and kind of self-referential, but works in the same way as Cabin in the Woods does, like as a standalone finite story. I can't remember what year it was. I want to say it's 2008.
I'm going to do a very quick Google. It is 2000. Did you say Shaun of the Dead? It's 2004.
Oh, holy shit!
2004.
Oh, well, that was way ahead of its time.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Oh, well, and there's also, Detention, which is the same year, the year before, 2011. And then there's The Final Girls, which we will cover down the line, which it comes a little bit later. But I
was about to say that must come a few years later. That was the other film I could kind of think of that's very meta in this way, isn't it? But
I think you're very right. I mean, because of the way that film production works anyway, like this film, The Cabin in the Woods, was shot, I think, in like 2009, and it didn't come out till 2011, 2012. So the same year as The Avengers. So it's not like they were made in the same year even. It does feel like a line in the sand for a certain brand of horror filmmaking, for sure. Yeah. It feels also like a specific end to this like OTT torture porn-esque vibe that had been so prevalent in the 2000s horror scene. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's very, you've eloquently put the very muddled thing that I was trying to get out there.
You made the point very eloquently.
No, I didn't at all, but you smashed it. Thanks.
So, Steph, before we wrap up our chat about The Cabin in the Woods, is there anything about the film that you wanted to mention that we haven't touched on?
I think the only other thing that I was thinking, and it ties into a lot of the things that we were talking about, is that idea of voyeurism and kind of the framing of this story, and the idea of a lot of the way this film is shot, especially at the beginning, is very voyeuristic. Like there's lots of shots of kind of through trees and windows, watching these teens as they're kind of put into place, by the puppeteers. And there's just this idea of voyeurism and watching as the audience, getting some kind of kick, some sort of basic kick out of wanting to see suffering and violence on screen for our own kind of pointless pleasure. And I don't know, part of me, it's not insulting, but like there's almost like a criticism of this film, as in positioning the audience as the ancient gods, and then kind of Whedon and Goddard are the kind of the enslaved engineers that are sort of pulling this film together to meet a need. I don't know, there's part of that feels like almost a little bit insulting. I don't know what you think.
I mean, I'm really into your reading of us, the audience, as the ancient gods. Although that does make you very right. That does make Whedon and Goddard Steve and Gary, and I do not want that. At least not for Whedon.
That's the bit that I don't like. I think that's the bit that when I was having a read around this, was kind of reading their kind of take on this film, and I think they were talking about it as a sort of their attempt to revitalize the genre and things like that. I was like, I'd always read this film very much as a celebration, a tongue-in-cheek celebration, but part of me felt a little bit like, oh, are you saying that kind of, I don't know, but the way that they position themselves, if they are positioning themselves as Gary and Steve, I don't know, that felt a bit more like, that was the bit I didn't like.
I mean, that, I really believe in the death of the author, so like whatever their intentions were, I'm a bit like, okay, good for you, but I have my rating. And like, I does fit in the style of Joss Whedon, you know, as much as I appreciate a lot of the things that he's created, I do not appreciate the man himself. And it does feel very much like something that he would probably feel like he's inserting himself into. Yeah. It does not take away from my love for Steve and Gary and for Bradley Whitford and Richard Jenkins.
Absolutely not. No, I would prefer to keep them as pure as possible. And it's certainly not my... It's not my preferred reading, but I know that it is a reading, so
I can see that.
Find it interesting. Yeah,
I can absolutely see that, and I think it's very valid, and it makes sense. It does make sense within the context of like who made this film as well, and in a way, like in some sort of way that I don't necessarily like, because you know I don't like Whedon, but it does it does make sense. Like, but also in conversely, they're positioning themselves. If we follow the thread of like Whedon and Goddard are Gary and Steve, they're cogs in the machine.
Yeah.
So they're not ultimately, you know, the myth makers. They're just pushing the buttons to make the myths.
It's an insult to themselves, really. Isn't it?
Exactly.
What are you saying about your own filmmaking? Yeah.
And then what is the role of the director? Like, is the director who's the director? Is she what, like Hollywood? The Hollywood system?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess. Maybe.
I think that's an interesting reading. Like, you could argue that.
There are, I think rewatching this film and spending time with it this week in a way that I haven't done before, because I have admittedly often watched this film because I get a kick out of all of the puzzles and the Easter eggs that we were talking about, and the humor. Like, I really enjoy it as a piece of horror comedy, and spending time thinking about it this week has really enforced that kind of that puzzle box idea, and the fact that it's much more sophisticated than I probably initially gave it credit for when I first viewed it 10 years ago. And also that there are so many different readings of this film, and some of them I completely agree with, some of them I'm not so sure about. But it actually, there's a lot you can credit this film with, and it's actually, I would always argue that it's kind of brilliant.
I think we can agree on that. I think that's a great note to end on as well.
Oh, good.
Steph, thank you so much for your time and for your insight on The Cabin in the Woods. And if people don't follow you already, where can they find more of your work online?
You can find me on Twitter at StephXMcKenna. You can also listen to me on the Thirst podcast and The Writing Life.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and for cheering me up after a very sorry week of feeling unwell. This has been a real joy.
Well, I'm the merman in this situation. Finally appeared.
Wait, does that make me Steve? Am I Steve? I've been waiting for Anna to appear as a beautiful merman. I've been blowing my conch all week and hoping she'll appear.
I did not know where that metaphor was going to
I just don't even know what I'm talking about. This is entirely being ill. I swear to God.